Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is narcissism evil? Now, this is an interesting question. It's kind of a blend of philosophy and science, and I've heard this question in many different forms. Are narcissists evil? Are narcissists bad people? Does evil lead to narcissism? Does narcissism lead to evil? So a lot of different questions, but all pretty much the same theme, looking at this potential relationship between narcissism and evil. So this one's kind of a difficult question to answer because it wanders into a few different areas. As I mentioned, this is really looking at philosophy and science. Now, I could talk about philosophy and science for hours. I'm a big fan of philosophy, theology, science, all the ways that we can understand the world, all the ways we can seek wisdom. But usually in my videos I try to focus more on the science side because psychopathology and counseling and appraisal and all these different areas are primarily scientific in the way we understand them and apply them as counselors. So just a very quick overview of philosophy and science, and I'll do my best to answer this question. So if we look at how we understand the world, how we gain wisdom, and we go back many years, first we see there was philosophy. And then natural philosophy was developed, and that led to science. So what was called natural philosophy, we now call science. So we have philosophy, which is the love of wisdom. It's an application of reason or logic in order to find knowledge. And we usually think about it in terms of finding meaning in life for kind of existential purposes, why we're here, what we should do, morals, ethics. Science is more concerned with the natural world. So it looks at the material world. It looks to find knowledge in constructs that we can observe or that we can observe indirectly. So we can develop instrumentation that can detect things that we can't directly sense and then convert that into something that we can sense. But either way, science is based on the material world. It looks at the material world as the source of knowledge. So if we observe, if we experiment, if we replicate those experiments, we can gain knowledge that way. In order for something to qualify as science, it must use the scientific method. It must involve, at some level, experimentation, observation, replication. So some, if not all, of the principles must be there to call something science. So we really have here two different ways to obtain knowledge. As I mentioned, I use both, philosophy and science, and I'm also a big fan of theology. And theology, you could argue, is both philosophy and science at the same time, but that's a whole other debate. I'm not going to worry about that right now. So really, I'm just focusing here on philosophy and science. So let's take a look at the question. Specifically, is narcissism evil? So first we have to understand narcissism. Narcissism is a construct that's scientifically defined. It's a tendency for certain behavior. We can define it using the 5-factor model, for example, openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. We look at the facets of those traits, and if we see certain facets endorsed at certain levels, we could call that narcissism. What we would look for, of course, is arrogance, envy, a lack of empathy. We'd look for somebody who has a lot of fantasies about success, wealth. We'd look for somebody who requires a lot of admiration, has a grandiose sense of self-importance. These are considered narcissistic characteristics. So we can measure narcissism, and that's the way we use it. We measure it, and we can help people to cope with it, to adapt to narcissism. We can help people who have been abused by individuals who are narcissistic through our scientific understanding of narcissism. Now let's look at the other part of the question. In order to get at evil, we have to ask, what is evil? Well, to look at evil in terms of defining it, it's really specific to what philosophical and, taking it further, theological beliefs somebody has. In general, we would say that evil is intentionally doing wrong. But here's where things become tricky. Is it doing more wrong than good? What if you do a lot of both? What if you do a lot of wrong, but just a little bit more good? It's difficult really to measure evil and even to define it in a way that kind of meets narcissism at the same level. I do believe evil is real, but it's not real from a scientific standpoint. It's not really part of the material world in the same way as we would see in the scientific method. Now, I know individuals who are interested in mental health have tried to study evil, and what they've really done is they've renamed evil. So, for example, we see attempts to measure depravity or wickedness, which you could argue is really the same thing as evil. And some have tried to get the word empathy in there. So that lack of empathy that we see with narcissism, they say, well, if we measure that, then that's evil. So really they're just taking two words and putting them together. They're simplifying the term evil, and they're making the term empathy more philosophical. We have a word for evil. We have a word for empathy. I don't know if mixing them together really helps anything. So that's just really a renaming exercise. The bottom line is it comes down to the definition of evil to answer this question, and there is no single definition. So one way to answer the question, is narcissism evil, would be to say that you're really comparing two things that can't be compared. But if you're really trying to ask, do individuals who are narcissistic do bad things? Do they make choices that can hurt people? Well, I'd say in some cases they do, and in some cases they don't. So if we look at another version of the question, are all narcissists evil? Well, if narcissism was based on choice, that people chose to be narcissistic, then I would say probably a lot of people that are narcissistic would be evil. But we know that personality is not a choice. You don't choose your personality. I mentioned this in a video I did before about, is narcissism a choice? So here I would say, if you're looking at evil as something that you choose to do, and you're looking at narcissism as something that can't be chosen, then I would say that I don't really see a relationship between narcissism and evil. I don't think the two really have anything to do with one another. Now, if you base it on empathy, if you say, well, if somebody has a lack of empathy and I call that evil, then are narcissists evil? I would say that just doesn't make sense based on what I said before, which is you're really just taking two words and calling them the same thing. Now, even though somebody becomes narcissistic through no fault of their own, right? We believe that people become narcissistic because of genetics and exposure to stressors, the environment. So even though it's not somebody's fault, they have the traits, people are still responsible for their own choices to a degree. So being narcissistic doesn't automatically mean there's no evil. So we have to look at this the other way too. Really what I'm saying here is the two are just unrelated. And this is actually pretty consistent with what we know from studying other areas of mental health. I mentioned the 5-factor model, and we can define narcissism through the 5-factor model. We would say the 5-factor model and evil are unrelated too. You wouldn't look at somebody who's conscientious or low in conscientiousness and say, well, they're evil. Or somebody who's agreeable or disagreeable. Or somebody who's extroverted or introverted and say one of those is evil and the other isn't. And if narcissism is really just a combination of those traits, I don't know how we could say narcissism is evil and then not also have other personality profiles, many of them, that we'd also call evil. It becomes very subjective at that point. We also know that mental health symptoms are unrelated. We don't think of mental health symptoms as evil. We wouldn't say if somebody's depressed or anxious or has obsessive compulsive tendencies or is suffering from recurrent memories like post-traumatic stress disorder, what we might see there. We wouldn't call those behaviors evil. So why would we single out narcissism or even narcissism and a few other personality traits? Why would we single those out if personality and mental health symptoms have generally been thought of as scientific and evil's generally thought of as philosophical? So other related questions here would be, could evil simply be expressed as narcissism? So with this question, evil would come first and then narcissism would be a product of evil. Well, I don't think this is the case either because of the way we think about narcissism. We know that narcissism starts early. Every child is narcissistic. And one conceptualization of narcissism is that individuals who go on to be narcissistic as adults simply never efficiently removed the narcissism they already had when they were children, again because of genetics and stressors. So really it's the same narcissism extended into adulthood. And there may be some more added on there, but that's one way to look at it. So in order to say that evil leads to narcissism, you'd really have to say that a young child could choose to be evil. They'd make that choice and then become narcissistic, and we know that's not really what seems to happen. narcissism would come first. How about the other question? Could it be that narcissism leads to evil? Well, I think that narcissism can certainly lead to a lot of bad choices, but to say that narcissism leads to evil is really taking out the free will component of evil. What we're really saying there would be that if somebody has a personality trait, they're destined to commit evil acts. So they really don't have a say in whether they have the personality traits, but now we hold them responsible for being evil. So I don't think this idea really makes a lot of sense either. I worry about this equating narcissism and evil. I see this a lot on YouTube. I see it a lot on blogs. This idea to me is kind of simplifying the personality construct and really even simplifying the nature of evil. It's labeling everybody in the same way. It's just saying, well, I know somebody's narcissistic, so now I must know something about them in terms of morality. And I think that's really a dangerous practice. I also think it's just dismissive. It's just looking at a very complex matter and saying, well, let's just call people evil and then be done with it. I think awareness about some of the dangers of narcissism, meaning this idea that narcissists can hurt other people, I think that awareness can occur without labeling people as evil. I don't think that really adds anything to protecting people from narcissistic behavior. It doesn't help the person who has narcissistic behavior, and it doesn't really help those around them. At least that's my opinion. Now, for counselors, I think this answer is even easier. We simply don't make moral judgments about clients. As a counselor, you'll see clients that have done all kinds of different behaviors, and some of those behaviors seem to be in violation of moral codes, and moral codes that a lot of people would subscribe to. So really very clear behavior that violates society's norms and moral codes. And no matter what somebody does when they come in to see a counselor, we're just not there to judge. It's not good for therapy. It's not part of our understanding of how to treat people. We don't think that's a helpful way to treat people. So for counselors, the issue is pretty easy. This question is pretty easy to answer. For non-counselors, I would say you really just have to decide your definition of evil and really think through if that's a useful way to conceptualize people with a particular personality trait. So again, how would I answer the question, is narcissism evil? I would say it's not, because you're really talking about constructs that cannot be compared. So I know whenever you mix philosophy and science, there's always a lot of ideas that are generated. If you have ideas about this question, maybe something I didn't cover or a different perspective, please put a comment. I'd be interested in reading that. It's always, again, very interesting to discuss how philosophy and science can work together and how sometimes they don't work together. I hope you found this description of narcissism and the construct of evil to be interesting. Thanks for watching.